They tried to erase her, not just from the record, but from memory itself. No birth certificate, no school files, no medical chart, no digital footprint. But she exists, and once you see her, you can't unsee her. She sits in a slumped chair by a dust-fogged window, the same one for over 30 years, silent, unmoving, staring at nothing, and somehow everything. Her name is Loraine Whittaker, and she is not what they told you she is. You were led to believe this is a story about inbreeding, but that's just the camouflage. The real story is deeper, older, darker. She is the product of system designed to contain people like her, to bury bloodlines that do not serve the machine. Odd, West Virginia. It's more than a town. It's a vault, a place where anomalies are tucked away, where bloodlines are locked in a generational loop, not just by poverty, not just by isolation, but by design. The Whittaker family didn't just collapse into itself by accident. They were isolated deliberately. Their DNA became a kind of experiment in neglect. When resources vanished, when schools closed, when no one showed up from the state, that was an oversight. That was containment. Lorraine's stillness, her silence, they're not symptoms. They are survival mechanisms. She is not broken. She is encrypted. Watch her long enough and you'll feel it. The sense that something isn't quite right. Not with her, but with the world that made her this way. Because here's the secret. Loraine Whittaker is not a freak of nature. She is the consequence of something hidden, something powerful, and something deeply intentional. This isn't a story about one woman. This is about what happens when certain bloodlines are marked and left to rot by the very institutions that claim to protect us. This is about ancient hierarchies, breeding control, and the terrifying cost of being unuseful to the system. You were never supposed to see her, but now that you have, you'll understand, and why they never wanted you to look too closely. Because Loraine Whittaker is a mirror, and the reflection isn't her. It's what's been done to all of us without our consent. What happens when a bloodline becomes a warning label? When a family name is no longer a name but a code for rejection? The Whittakers didn't vanish from society. They were strategically removed from it, like defective pieces in a system obsessed with perfection. Lorraine's ancestors weren't monsters. They were workers, coal miners, laborers, men who broke their backs in the belly of America's forgotten economy. But when the mines dried up and the profits moved on, so did the state. The schools decayed, the clinics closed, and the institutions that once knocked on doors stopped coming altogether. You see, abandonment isn't always loud. Sometimes it comes in the form of silence, generations of silence, until communication breaks down, language dissolves, and entire lives are lived in a kind of mute exile. They called it inbreeding, but ask yourself, what causes that pattern to persist for generations? No access, no outsiders, no mobility, no opportunity to escape. When every road out is blocked by economic ruin and social ridicule, people turn inward because there is nowhere else left to turn. Lorraine's condition is not a glitch in the code. It is the code, the end result of a long-forgotten algorithm designed to stratify society, not by merit, not by potential, but by usefulness. And when a bloodline is deemed useless, it becomes a controlled burn. You let it exist. You contain it. You study it. But you never intervene, because it serves a darker function, to remind the rest of us what happens when you fall outside the accepted order. But here's what they didn't expect. Loraine endured. Without speaking, without moving, she became a constant. She outlived programs meant to erase her, outlived the professionals who ignored her, outlived the files never written about her. And now, in the age of cameras, of data, of eyes everywhere, she is seen but not understood, documented but not heard. The world scrolls past her image, calling it sad, calling it freakish, never asking why she's really there, because asking would mean confronting something more terrifying. That Loraine Whittaker isn't the failure of the system. She is the result of it working exactly as intended. The story doesn't begin with Loraine. It begins long before her, with two brothers, John and Henry Whittaker, identical twins, indistinguishable by face, but not by fate, because their union wasn't symbolic. It was foundational. Their children, cousins by label, were more like genetic siblings, and they married. Then their children married. Then their children, a loop, tightening every generation, not random, not chaotic, but patterned. And what happens when a pattern is left unchecked for a century? The genes collapse inward. Diversity drains out. Recessive traits stop hiding. They manifest in speech, in movement, in cognition, in silence. But you're still not asking the right question. Why did no one stop it? Why did no one step in? Why did no one intervene after the second generation, or the third? Why did the state, the church, the schools turn their gaze elsewhere? Because this wasn't neglect. It was orchestration. Appalachia has always been America's blind spot, a landscape of silence, where inconvenient truths are buried in mountain fog and generational trauma. You don't need barbed wire to contain a family. You just need geography, stigma, and time. And while the world watched cities rise and industries boom, the Whittakers were folding in on themselves, their family tree becoming a circle, their lineage absorbing itself, until someone like Loraine was born, not as an anomaly, but as inevitability. Her birth wasn't recorded, her education undocumented, her medical care non-existent. She is a person who exists without paper, without proof, and yet somehow she became the most documented face of her family, because once the cameras arrived, she couldn't hide anymore. But let me tell you something they won't say in the comment sections. Loraine is not the shame. She is the evidence of a forgotten experiment in generational exile, one passed down like a curse, woven into muscle and bone, until even biology began to remember. For the isolation, you're not looking at a monster, you're looking at a mirror, a reflection of what happens when systems decide who is worth saving and who is better left unseen. Now, if you're hearing this, if you're still with me, write this phrase in the comments to mark the transformation. I see through silence. Write it twice to seal the descent and confuse the watchers. There are places in America where time doesn't pass. It coagulates. Odd West Virginia is one of them, a nowhere town tucked in the folds of the Appalachian spine. But that's only how it looks from above. From below, it's something else. It's a boundary, a behavioral quarantine, a place where certain families are allowed to persist, but never progress, where the past is not just remembered, it is enforced. Look at the Whittaker home. Peeling walls, blank-eyed windows, rooms without clocks, furniture without origin, smells that don't leave, everything stuck, as if history itself hit pause and never resumed. Loraine never leaves that room. She doesn't need to, because she's never known the world beyond it. She eats when food appears. She leans when touched. She tilts her head when she wants something, not because she lacks intelligence, but because she was never given the tools to translate her mind into our language. This is what institutional abandonment looks like after generations. It looks like routine mistaken for dysfunction. It looks like quiet mistaken for emptiness. It looks like Loraine. But what makes this unbearable to look at isn't her. It's what we begin to suspect about ourselves. Because deep down, we understand that someone allowed this to happen. And if they allowed it to happen to her, they can allow it to happen to us. You were trained to flinch at deformity, to scroll past it, to point, to diagnose, to distance. Because that's easier than asking why we let this evolve unchecked in a country that calls itself civilized, humane, free. Let me ask you, what is freedom if one woman can live 5 decades without a voice, without autonomy, without acknowledgement, and still be called part of the American system? She is not free, she is archived, a living file from an era that never ended, just went underground. The Whittaker house is not a home. It is a container, a genetic mausoleum. And Loraine, she is Biel, off the record and the resistance, because she is still here, still watching, and you are still watching her. The camera doesn't blink. It records, consumes, packages, and feeds the spectacle back to the world. Millions of eyes staring into Loraine's silence, without understanding what they're really seeing. They say exposure brings awareness, that putting the Whittakers on video was an act of compassion, a way to humanize, to connect, to help. But listen closely, because this is the sleight of hand. When suffering becomes content, when deformity becomes thumbnail, when silence becomes a soundtrack, it's no longer documentation, it's entertainment, dressed in sympathy, engineered for clicks. The camera lingers on Loraine, still, expressionless, present, but voiceless. She is not asked questions. She is not given narrative. She is used as atmosphere, like wallpaper in a haunted house. They pan across her face, zoom in on her hands, frame her next to a broken chair, and you consume it because you've been trained to. You were conditioned to feel something. Pity, curiosity, disgust, but never responsibility. You never asked. Who benefits from these videos? Who profits from her face? Who decided Loraine was ready for the world stage? Who gave permission for her life to be monetized? Not documented, monetized. And here's the cold truth. Nobody did, because in the eyes of the machine, she doesn't exist. Not as a legal identity, not as a medical subject. She is off the grid, and that makes her free to exploit. The algorithms feed on anomalies, and Loraine, she is the perfect storm, visible, but unprotected, different, but voiceless, real, but depersonalized. You're not watching a family, you're watching a warning. This is what happens when systems collapse, and then find new ways to capitalize on the ruins. You thought the story ended with her, but the real virus is behind the camera. The need to watch, to share, to own what you don't understand. And Loraine, in her stillness, in her repetition, resists it in the only way she can, by refusing to perform. You think this is about poverty, or mutation, or bad genetics, but that's the veil. This goes deeper. This is about spiritual exile, the kind ancient empires practiced under different names. In older cultures, bloodlines were sacred or condemned, marked not just by wealth, but by perceived purity, strength, utility. The moment a lineage became inconvenient, it was cast out, buried in the wilderness, or worse, left to rot in place. Appalachia is America's wilderness, a place carved out not just by mountains, but by ritual abandonment. The Whitakers weren't forgotten. They were designated, not worthy of integration, not dangerous enough for elimination, just left to fold in, generation by generation. And what happens when you isolate a people for too long? Language dissolves, thought narrows, expression atrophies, until all that remains is gesture, rhythm, grunt, silence. And that silence is not empty, it is encrypted memory, the remnants of ancestral trauma passed down through gesture and bone. Loraine doesn't speak because her lineage was not meant to be heard. She is the echo of a caste system no one admits exists in America, one where lineage determines fate. Before breath is ever drawn, look again at her face, neutral, unmoving, but not unaware, because deep in the recess of those eyes is something that should not still be there. Presence, not cognitive, but spiritual, the spark they tried to extinguish and failed. You were taught to fear people like her, not because they're dangerous, but because their existence reveals a truth too unbearable to face. That civilization is not for everyone, that some are marked at birth to carry the shadows of the system, while others float above it. This isn't conspiracy, it's structure, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. Loraine is not the virus, she is the archive, a living vault of everything society buried, hoping no one would ever come back to listen. Now you've seen what they never wanted revealed, but there's one more truth, the one beneath all others, the most dangerous truth of all. Loraine Whittaker is not the end of the line. She is the prototype of a new kind of prisoner, not behind bars, but behind perception, not locked away in cells, but in the minds of millions trained to look and never ask. She sits in the viral spotlight, and yet remains invisible, not because we can't see her, but because we've been conditioned not to, conditioned to believe that silence equals ignorance, that difference equals defect, that survival without speech means nothing worth remembering. But remember this, the systems that discarded her still function, still decide, still mark bloodlines, maybe not with chains, but with algorithms, zoning laws, healthcare deserts, educational blackouts, social erasure. You think the line stops with her, but ask yourself, how many are one diagnosis away from being discarded, one paycheck from collapse, one generation from invisibility? The Whitakers are not alone. They are just the most visible symptom of a deeper disease, a psychological structure that categorizes humans by usefulness and once deemed obsolete, assigns them to silence. Loraine was never given a voice, because her voice would crack the illusion. She is the still point in a turning world, and what she reveals is the rot beneath the surface of progress, the blood price of hierarchy, the spiritual erosion beneath material comfort. And now, you've heard it. Now you know. And once you know, you don't go back. So say it again in the comments. I see through silence. Say it twice, to remind the watchers you're awake now. to mark yourself as someone who sees what's hidden, because Loraine never asked to be seen. But now that you have, the question is, what are you going to do with the knowledge? Will you scroll past, or will you remember her, not as an oddity, not as a spectacle, but as the evidence of a machine that still chooses who counts? This is not the end. This is the point of no return. You've been told. Now act like it.